Welcome to Good Grief, the podcast where resilience meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Malone. In this podcast, we delve deep into the stories of individuals who've triumphed over tragedy, adversity, and trauma. In every episode, we bring you raw and honest narratives from guests who faced life's most challenging moments head on. Through candid conversations, they share their journeys of resilience, shedding light on the strategies, mindset shifts, and support systems that empowered them to rise above their darkest hours. Join us as we explore the profound depths of human resilience and discover how, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and yes, good grief. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest today is Bill Ratner. He's a published poet, nationally known voice actor, and volunteer grief counselor. So, Bill, if you would like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your story.
Thanks, Christine. The podcast, of course, is Good Grief. So we're not talking about baseball or football or even poetry, although I'm happy to talk about it a little bit. I work as a voice actor. That's how I make my living. And don't sound like I'm 45, but to this day, I still get to do some cable news promo and the occasional cartoon and so on like that. That's how I survive happily. And interestingly enough, I work for the same individuals. The people who hire me have exactly the same title as my father had. My dad died when I was 13, and he was executive vice president of marketing for General Mills when he died. And when I started working in voiceovers, I realized that the individuals who would meet me at the voiceover sessions in the studios and would hand me their card, it would say executive vice president of marketing for such and such ad agency or such and such corporation. And so, ironically, I've been performing for my father my entire career.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I enjoy conversations like where we've been having before we went on the air today and we're about to have is my story is a little unusual. I was not abused by my parents. I look at it as having been abused by fate. I was born into a very happy and very healthy family in Des Moines, Iowa. My mother and father both graduated from the University of Chicago. My mother with a master's in social work, and my father with a master's in business administration. And he, at the time I was born, was managing editor of Better Homes and Gardens magazine. Mm-hmm. And I had an older brother who was 6 when I was born. And we had the ideal American life, post-war baby boom. I learned about my mother's breast cancer when I was 5.5, when she very wisely, I realized, it took me years to realize, said to me in the summer of 1952, "You and I are going to take a bath. I have something to show you." And I don't remember the last time I'd taken a bath with my mother. I was probably 2 years old. And we got in the bathtub, and she showed me her scar. She'd had a complete mastectomy. And she said, "I want you to know that I'm in remission, as the doctors call it, and I'm healthy now, and I don't want you to worry." I have really no memory of having worried about my mother's health. I don't have a conscious memory before that. I was in preschool and then the first part of kindergarten. And this was the first time that a conscious acknowledgement of my mother's health issues was made in the household. My dad never talked about it. I can only guess, because my brother is no longer alive, that he was more aware, if not consciously, at least somehow, that there were things going wrong in the house. Lucky for all of us, my mother was not a hysterical person, not an anxious person, not a depressed person, had been trained in geriatric social work, and that was her field before she married my father. So she was very familiar with health issues of specifically probably breast cancer in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and this is the 50s. My father then took a fancy job with an ad agency. We moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my brother and I were put in public schools, and my mother's health worsened. And to cut to the chase, when I was seven and a half, 2 years after she revealed to me that she had a mastectomy, I came home from school from second grade, got off the school bus and walked up the hill to my house. And here was my mother and my then 13-year-old brother and our Unitarian minister, Dr. Carl Storm. And she said, well, now that you're here, Billy, we can continue. Dr. Storm is our minister from church, but he's also my psychotherapist. And a psychotherapist is someone who I visit every week. That's why I'm home late for supper on Thursday nights. And I remember exactly what she said. I don't know if I could quote word for word, but the memory of the bath with her and the mastectomy scar was not traumatic for me. It was sort of interesting to look at her scar, and then her other breast, of course, was very healthy and normal looking. Didn't scare me, mainly because of the way that she behaved, and she wasn't putting it on. She was relaxed. She knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. She was letting her 5-year-old son know that perhaps she had assumed that I had absorbed some of the anxiety in the house, but that this was an answer to that this is reality and that things are going to get better. Sadly, over the next 2 years, they didn't. And so the next thing that she chose to do was what I call these days a death counseling session. Mm-hmm. And she said, I go and see Dr. Storm every week, and I talk about my illness and how I feel about it. And I talk about how I worry about your daddy. At that point, I didn't know exactly what she meant. And I talk about how much I love you boys. And then she said, and this is pretty close to a direct quote, which I remember at age 7, this is what one does when one is in crisis. You seek help. And my memory of this afternoon, this 20 minutes, because after that she said, is there anything you boys want to ask? And of course, my brother and I just sort of clammed up. My 13-year-old brother was probably sad and perhaps even angry. And I was just taken aback and didn't know what to say or ask. And that was really kind of the end of the session. We sort of sat around uncomfortably, and then Dr. Storm got up and left. But my memory of it is not that it wasn't a traumatic moment at all. It was yet another moment at which my mother had totally come through for us. Mm-hmm. That, and I, in retrospect, did I follow her advice? I could be very facile and say, well, yes, I followed my mother's advice. And, truth is, I've done years of psychotherapy, most of which has been extremely helpful. And am I embarrassed to say so? No, I deserve it. I deserve the opportunity to talk about all this. But looking back at age 77 with a 38-year marriage, just celebrated 38 years, my fabulous artist, school teacher wife, and 2 adult daughters, one of whom just gave us 2 grandchildren, a fabulous 2.5-year-old, my best friend, who I pick up from school 3 times a day. How did that happen? How is it that I didn't become a serial killer or heroin addict or, an alcoholic who dies at age 45 of liver disease? And I attribute my mental health in the face of all this to my mother and my loving dad. My dad was a little more awkward and not quite as psychologically hip or aware, but I attribute it to the fact that my parents were not abusers, they were not emotionally repressed, and that she took the lead in making decisions. What must I do? What should I do as a parent to acknowledge reality to my boys?
And of course, you do realize that's not common, even today.
No, it's not common.
I mean, extremely uncommon back in the 50s and 60s, but today, so many people don't talk to their kids about these issues. I would guess they don't want to bring reality to them at a certain age. I don't really know. I know in my case, I talked to my kids about various issues as they've come up over the years because I want them to be prepared. Yeah. And I hope that I remember even having a conversation one time that I had my oldest son in therapy after his dad died when he was 4. And my comment was, I would hope that whatever he can be helped with today will not be there when he's 30 and he's having to then deal with it, as an adult. So, I think helping kids is a big deal. Do you think that I think you phrase it as a grief counseling when the minister was there, did you think that actually was helpful, or was it more just the way mom
it's interesting. He said virtually nothing. And I don't, I'm going to guess that this situation was so unusual for him, and of course for her, that that there was no pro forma. There was no, well, this is what one does in this situation. The fact that they did it at all,
Yeah.
I consider myself very lucky.
Yeah.
It didn't last very long. I think I remember sitting there for probably 15 minutes, and they were near the end. It was sort of awkward because, I think the only thing Dr. Storm said was, "Is there anything you boys would like to ask me, or would like to ask?" He may have said.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I just said a few minutes ago, my brother and I just sort of sat there, and I wasn't terribly uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to ask.
Right.
Had I been 25, I would have had a lot of things to ask.
Right.
But so I think the kind of, I like to say magic, because there are many times when I ask myself, how is it that I am allowed to trust enough to have a happy marriage? How is it that I'm allowed to have a career that I haven't messed up with drugs and alcohol and robbing 7-Eleven stores? I attribute it to my mother's mental health and her foresight. But, as you just alluded to, we were a privileged family. She came from an upper middle class family in Glencoe, Illinois. Her father was a civil engineer for the city of Chicago. She was well educated with a master's degree from University of Chicago. And so I was a lucky kid. Had we been the typical working middle class American family, as you just spoke about, the idea of talking to children about death is, I don't want to drive this kid crazy. I don't want this kid to go over the edge. Oh, no, let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, without the ability to interpret what's going on, that might be the smarter thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. I mean, I had a guest on my show whose mother took her own life when he was only 10. And his family didn't talk about it. And so here he's, as an adult, trying to make sense. I mean, they didn't even tell him that she'd committed suicide. They just said she passed. And so he really had to make sense of this, and stories just didn't match. And over the years, and I think, to me, I was thinking, your family kind of did you a disservice. It's a sad conversation to have, but you leave the kid, if you don't talk to him about it, you leave the kid thinking, especially as children, they tend to self-internalize things too, what did I kind of thing. So I love hearing stories where people actually bring those conversations up with their kids, because it's life, unfortunately, and it's just,
well, I'm being a little airy fairy here, because the dark side of it is, once my mother died, my father was not as hip as I'd like to say, or as psychologically aware or conscious or sentient about these issues.
Right.
Neither was anyone else. We had a nice extended family. We had aunts and uncles who were loving and sweet, but I became a very angry, resentful kid because people didn't do what my mother was capable of doing.
Yeah.
That, my dad stayed at work until late hours, and, he's a loving, sweet, physically affectionate guy, and I was lucky I had him. But there was really no one else. And I was lucky I got what I got. But then the absence of my mother and her wisdom and her kindness and her good sense, made me a mouthy, cursing little boy.
Okay. Yeah, it's almost like you knew what you could have, or you know what you did,
and ended up pretty angry for many years to what I didn't get.
So you were then, you were 6 then when she passed away?
7. I was 7.
7. Yeah. That is incredibly young. And then I know it was just a few years later that your brother passed away. So
yeah, my dad, almost exactly a year later, married my stepmother, who was a terrific woman. This was very early this is the mid-50s, and she was an advertising executive. She was director of marketing for Campbell Methuen Ad Agency in Minneapolis, the biggest ad agency west of the Mississippi. And so a very unusual woman and a lovely person. And we had the halcyon years of our family after my mother's death. She was a golfer. She had a cabin in the woods. She gave up her career to raise me and my brother. She adopted me and my brother, which she did not have to do, having married my dad, but she did, asked our permission to do so. And sadly, when my brother turned 17, he developed kidney disease. At the time, it was called chronic glomerulonephritis. And my father passed it off as a football injury. My brother was a junior varsity football player. And slowly but surely, over his junior and senior year, he began to go downhill. Doctors forbade him from playing contact sports. No more football, no more baseball. You can play golf, you can swim. He was captain of the swimming team. My brother was a big, tall, handsome, curly-haired, green-eyed boy. And he went away to college for a year, came out to California and went to what was then called Claremont Men's College, and came back. And when I was away at camp for a month, he entered the hospital, and I didn't know this, but apparently he was quite close to death. And then he had a bit of a remission, came out, and we all, I think, traveled to Chicago to see aunts and uncles. And long story short, entered the hospital. I saw him for the last time in a hospital about a week before he died. And this was a year before kidney transplants began in the American medical profession. And I don't quite recall when dialysis was invented, but it was not in use. My brother died in October 1960. And my poor dad, this is his eldest son. And my dad was away fighting in World War II in the Pacific Theater on a destroyer escort in the Navy when my big brother Pete was growing up, was 3 and 4 years old. And so my dad returned from the war. They were strangers. So he and my dad had a very different relationship from the relationship I had with my dad. I looked like my dad. I was born after the war. He was able to hold me as a baby and, play with me as a toddler, unlike his relationship with my brother when he was gone at war. So his losing my brother, I have a tendency to say killed him. He was a very hardworking guy. He was overweight. He smoked cigars, not a drinker at all. But I learned after his death from a heart attack 3.5 months after my brother died that my stepmother had put him on the Valium of the day, which ironically was called Miltown. I think it was called Milton, which was the most popular prescription drug in America in the early 1960s. And we were replaced by Valium, and who knows what's being taken now. But 3.5 months after my brother died, I came home from a 8th grade dance with my friend Rudy Gamitro, who was waiting for his mom to pick him up. And I went upstairs and said, "Where's Dad?" And my stepmother woke up and said, "Well, he's in the bathroom." And the bathroom door was closed. And I opened the door, and my father was lying behind the door. And I ran next door to get the doctor, the medical doctor, Dr. Richard Anderson was his name, who was actually head of the School of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota, MD. And he had me wait at his house with his wife and his son, and came back about 20 minutes later and said, "Well, your dad didn't make it." And I recall all this very starkly. I was nearly 14 years old. And the clearest memory to me was as I ran down the stairs and out the house toward Dr. Anderson's house next door. It's Minnesota. It was February. And I slid to a stop on our grass lawn. It was slightly sloped toward the sidewalk. And I looked up at the sky. It was dark. I don't know if there was a moon out or if I could see the stars or what. but I literally said the words in my head. They came right into my head as I stopped myself from falling. I will never, ever be this afraid of anything like this again. Those are the words that I said. And over the years, I've tried to parse that. What does that mean? That, in other words, I don't ever, to fate, to God, don't ever, this is enough already.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. I think probably my guess is, having been somewhat in that same situation where I've said something of the same, it's trying to take some power back because you feel so powerless in a situation.
Yeah. I sounded very brave to myself.
Yeah.
And
And I completely get the whole, when you say fate or God or whatever it might be, I'm trying to say, enough is enough. I got like mom, my brother, and now my dad, and that's enough. And the anger that comes with that, which of course is part of the grief process.
And I was lucky that my dad's little sister, my Aunt Ann, was a special ed teacher for the Chicago Public Schools. And immediately she flew from Chicago and after the funeral and all, and met with my stepmother. And I remember overhearing her yelling at my stepmother, "You get this boy into therapy. You get this boy into therapy." And my mother, or stepmother rather, finally agreed and took me to the Minneapolis Clinic of Psychiatry and Neurology. And I was introduced to a PhD named Dr. Sherman E. Nelson, who I actually looked up. I mean, we're talking 1961. I actually Googled him a couple of years ago, and there was a paper by him and a photograph of him. And he invited her to join me for sessions. She refused. She was not interested. So I attended weekly therapy sessions, maybe 40 weeks a year, for about a year and a half. And I was allowed for 50 minutes, an hour every week to just tell the story over and over and over and over. And I never resented the sessions. He would sit there smoking. I think he smoked Salem cigarettes. I remember he smoked a menthol cigarette. And he would sit there, he put his feet up on the big drawer from his desk, and he would just sit there like this, just listening the whole time. And finally, somebody was listening. To me, that was the magic of therapy. This guy really looked interested.
Yeah.
And I don't remember one word that he said until the very, very end, which surprised me. And I've actually had therapists since then who've said, "Gee, that's a little unusual." It had been about 18 months, and he said, "Well," almost as though he'd rehearsed this, he said, "I think we've come to the end of the road together. And you've done very well. And I consider you to be," I guess by that time I was almost 16 years old. He said, "You're a very emotionally mature young man. But you have two problems. One, you're undisciplined. You have discipline problems in school. You're not doing your homework." And I had to leave a private school, not because of behavioral problems, but I just wasn't doing homework, and go to public school. And he said, "Your second problem is your stepmother. She's an emotionally immature person, and she's an alcoholic, and she refuses treatment." And so my reaction to that was, yeah, I can blame her for everything. Thank you for, I didn't say this to him. I thought, well, okay. I didn't much care. I no longer had to lie to my friends about where I went on, Tuesday afternoons. I didn't tell a soul. I had friends from my neighborhood and from school. How come how come you can't play ball? I've got to do chores. And so I was sort of not relieved that I wasn't going to have to come back. But that was the thought I think that passed through my head was, well, I don't have to BS my friends anymore. And okay, if this is, he didn't ask me. He didn't say, "Is that okay with you? Or do you want to continue?" That was apparently the treatment modality at the time, 1961 or 2. And that led to some really rough years between me and my stepmother. And I understand why she drank. She came from a rough family and was dealing with grief and dealing with an adolescent boy. Adolescent boys can be just brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And, in a happy family, they could be brutal. I mean, I've had dinner with parents when my kids were adolescents. They were girls, but who had boys. And, my son's 12 now and he won't go to the symphony with me and he just has such horrible manners. And I'm always so surprised to hear this. But we had rough years and I had an okay time. I had friends and smoked cigarettes with my buddies in the basement in high school and went to college and flunked out, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll were the name of my game for until I discovered the theater and started acting when I was 22. Ironically, started acting, playing other characters.
And then eventually, or at some point in time, you got into writing poetry. So how did that come about?
Yeah, I ended up in a career from the theater to being a morning show host on radio, to doing voiceovers, and got into the storytelling scene when the Moth was invented, the Moth Radio Hour and all that.
Oh, yeah.
There was one little venue in Northeast Los Angeles, a Korean barbecue, that had a tiny little 35-seat theater for musicians. They had shows on the weekends that hosted the Moth in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And when I learned that you could go and tell true personal stories, it was about 2010.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a lot of stories to tell. And they have a theme every month. You can go on the website, themoth.org. And if there's a moth in your town, the theme for the month might be hair or love hurts or cars or family.
Mm-hmm.
And the theme changes every week. And I totally immersed myself in the storytelling scene and ended up getting paid and ended up going on the road doing stories. And the personal storytelling scene was brand new in the U.S. People were getting up and telling painful stories, funny stories, embarrassing stories. And I was volunteering. I got a role in a TV cartoon called G.I. Joe, and went into a toy store after a couple of years at G.I. Joe and realized that Hasbro was making billions off of the 85 action figures they were selling in the vehicles. And I thought, shouldn't I give kids a clue as to what's being sold to them? And there was a little public elementary school down the hill from me, and so I volunteered with a program called TV Cartoon Scandals Media Awareness for Children. And we had great fun for years. I did this for about 30 years until COVID came along.
Mm.
And we would talk about commercials. What do they try to sell you on TV and so on? And just to give kids an edge on what, the sort of satanic brilliance of television. And of course, later the internet to sell children goods and services that they may or may not need.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at a storytelling, teaching a workshop at a storytelling conference at Brigham Young University, which is very big on storytelling. And a woman said, have you written a book about this storytelling media awareness for kids? And I said, no. She said, well, my husband and I just started a publishing company, Familius Books. Submit a proposal. So I did. And we signed a contract and I started writing and I sent them 85 pages and I thought this would be a nice short book. And they wrote back, said, this is just great, but we're not going to publish an 85-page book. Double it. So what do I do? And so I literally had to go back to college. I went into a low residency MFA program, UC Riverside Palm Desert, with creative nonfiction teachers. I interviewed parents, I interviewed kids, I ended up doubling the length of it. It got published. But in the process of writing it, my writing to me personally, the publisher liked it. It sounded the same way that I wrote letters home to my stepmother when I was a kid from camp. So I started taking a poetry course from a guy named Jack Grapes in Los Angeles, great big guy, funny guy, who's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. Got one poem published in 2018. I thought, this is addictive. These are short. I don't have to write a 4,000-word story. I don't have to write a 60,000-word novel. I can write a 75-word poem. Poems can be happy, they can be sad, they can be ironic. One kid whose mom is a poet says, Mom, would you read another one of those word movies? And since then, I now have my third book of poetry coming out from a poetry press in Long Beach, California, called Slow Lightning Lit. And it's certainly not full of grief poems, but there are a lot in there. And the title is Lamenting While Doing Laps in the Lake. And so that's a long-winded answer, Christine, to your question of how from all that to writing poems.
No, I completely get it. Do you hear from people that, read any of your poems and tell you that they've, really resonated with them or something, anything along those lines?
Yeah, I've ended up through an organization called the National Association of Poetry Therapy, which is a lot of therapists and poets. I've ended up leading some workshops, a lot of folks dealing with grief issues. And they had correspondence with them and so on. Mainly the workshop is about them, not so much about me. But also in lots and lots of live Zooms, especially during COVID and since people going on Zoom, you get reaction to the poems. I'm in a featured reader on 100 different Zooms, and people will comment afterward and so on. Mm-hmm. So I'm not, I can't pretend to say I'm writing this for other people. I'm writing it for me. Mm-hmm. And if the best experience I ever had was in the Hollywood Fringe Festival. It's like the New York Fringe Festival or the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, only as Los Angeles happens in the month of June. I did a one-man show of my personal story. And a woman who's a stand-up comic and a voice actress came up to me after the show and she was sobbing. She didn't have to say a word. She'd watched me for 55 minutes tell my story, and she threw her arms around me and we both cried and did not say a word to each other. And she nodded and turned away and said goodnight. And that was prose, but it was, 35 pages of prose that I worked on for about a year as to how do I tell this story. And I was studying poetry at the time, of course. And so, there have been reactions at poetry readings of people saying things, but yeah, you just hope that somehow, somewhere, it resonates with somebody.
Yeah, I'm certain that it does. I want to get to, I know you do volunteer grief counseling. So how did you get started with that? And what does that look like?
There's an organization called the MISS Foundation, MISS, that is headquartered in Austin, Texas. And the woman who founded it teaches at, I believe, at Arizona State. And I think I saw something on the web, volunteer grief training, and looked it up and thought, gee, this is a weekend in Sedona, Arizona. That'd be fun. What a beautiful place. And so I put out my $350 or whatever it was and flew there and have a friend in Phoenix. And my wife joined me for Saturday and swam in the pool while I dealt with grief issues with mainly psychiatric social workers, therapists, hospice workers. I and one other guy were the only non-mental health professionals. He was a Methodist minister from Alabama, and I'm a voice actor from Hollywood. And it was absolutely fascinating. There was no certification, but I think that the people who are mental health professionals were getting, professional credit, job training stuff. And then I discovered, I realized I'm not going to go back for further training. I'm not going to fly to Sedona. Is there anything in LA? And I think somebody from the organization said, yes, contact Our House Grief, which has been around for, I think, 35, 40 years in West Los Angeles, that runs adult grief groups in person, teen grief groups in person, and ran a program in the schools, the public schools, for kids who've lost someone within the last year to death. And so I chose that program and ended up, luckily for me, working right before COVID, sadly, right I think we started in November. So it was a 10-week program that lasted into the middle of February of 2020. Once a week for 10 weeks, I met with 6 13-year-old kids, all eighth graders in a public middle school, all of whom had lost one person to death. One kid watched his brother shot in a gang fight. Another kid, his grandmother died. Another kid, his father died, etc. And absolutely brilliant curriculum of how to deal with kids, what to ask them, how to get them to write, how to get them to draw pictures, how to get them to talk, how to get them to talk each other, support each other. And a social worker from the school sat in, but played a passive role. I think by law there had to be somebody there. And then came COVID. And sadly, this particular program ministered unto families that did not have Wi-Fi. Kids probably didn't own computers. And so the program ended, and I ended up hooking up with the National Association of Poetry Therapy and working with adults. Was trained for about 6 months. I did training workshops with a wonderful woman, a poet in Santa Barbara, California, named Perry Longo, Longo. And then just offshoots of that, people asking me, would you be willing to run a poetry group? Can you do it for 2 weeks? Can you do it for a month? Can you do, this? And so it's sort of ad hoc like that. And there are 3 groups that I've been in for years that we now meet on Zoom. And and not everybody is writing grief poems, but certainly that's an element of our work together as colleagues and poets and friends.
So are you like always writing something, or it's like a work in progress? Keep going. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I wear 2 hats. One is as a memoirist. I've had a couple chapters of the memoir published in literary magazines, and hopefully in the last year of a 10-year project of trying to write about my story.
Yeah.
And I like the process of writing and editing, but I'm an avoider. This stuff is it's painful, and I want to get it right. And if I didn't have fabulous editors and folks, not ghostwriting by any chance, I write every word, but folks that I can show a manuscript to and say, hey, what do you think? And they'll say, well, get closer to the feeling here in this chapter. I don't know what's going on in your head. If I didn't have people like that, I'd give it up. But poetry, I'm addicted to. It's and as a voice actor, as a performer, the poetry originally was written for performers to speak aloud, and it's more fun than anything. Last year, I produced a show in the Hollywood Fringe with myself and 2 female poets who are just brilliant. And we hired a director and had 55 minutes of just really wild, interesting stuff, and packed houses. And we're going to do it again, I think, in June of 2025.
Now that we've gotten somewhat past COVID and we can get out into the real world again without having to constantly be on Zoom. I mean, I do Zoom all day long for my work, but still, it's nice to get out there again and do other things, especially in person. So you have been a fascinating guest. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish?
If anybody's interested in reading grief poems, they're short. And when I sit down with a book of poetry, I'm not a poetry freak. I'm a lazy reader. My room is littered, part of the reason my background is blurred, littered with piles of unread books and manuscripts. But when I do read somebody's poetry, either somebody I don't know who's been recommended or a friend, I'll lie down on my bed by myself and read it aloud. Yeah. People who are grieving, people who are writing, go on Amazon to Bill Ratner and check out my books and others. And, Google grief poetry, and there is a lot out there that can be when you're reading other people's words and you're slowing down, they enter your body, they enter your heart, and can bring you on a voyage that can be enlightening and helpful, and can can make for an interesting emotional moment.
Yeah. Well, we are going to, in the podcast notes for this episode, add in links so that people can find you quite easily without having to do a search. So we will definitely do that. I'm looking forward to reading some of your stuff myself. So I call it when I buy books, and I'm a purist, I like my book on paper. I call it added to my library. So it's like, okay, I am going to get to that one someday. More books than I could possibly get to, I think. But, yeah, I buy them because I got to get to that one. But thank you again for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for what you do, Christine. I mean, this what we're talking about is so important to so many people.
True.
And unfortunately, it's not talked about enough by as many. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Good Grief. We hope that stories shared today have inspired and empowered you on your own journey of resilience. If you want to dive deeper into the themes of trauma, tragedy, and survival, be sure to check out my memoir, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival. In this book, I shared my own raw and honest experiences, offering insights and strategies for overcoming life's toughest challenges. You can purchase the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or listen to it on Audible. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to light and spread a message of hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories on our next episode. Until then, remember, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and good grief.